Hello and welcome everybody to another episode of Books and Bytes. Today, um, we're diving deep into Cato's
Oh
letters.
yeah, Cato's letters. These essays, they were published anonymously in newspapers. They reached a wide audience, stirred up all sorts of arguments about how governance should work and what individual liberty really means.
So Cato's letters, it's a series of essays published anonymously. They tackle big issues like individual liberty, the use of reason, and the dangers of tyranny. The authors used the pen name Cato, after a Roman statesman, known for his strong defense of liberty. They really went after things like corruption, the abuse of power, and anything they saw as a threat to freedom.
They give us a look into how thinkers during the Enlightenment period, wrestled with issues that are still very much alive today.
Yeah.
Things like how power should be balanced, the importance of free speech, the dangers of having a large standing army, and the role of reason in society.
Okay, so to really understand these letters, I feel like we need to dive right into the main text.
Yeah.
And just see how these themes play out.
Absolutely. It's fascinating to see how they weave these ideas together.
Yeah. From what I've read, the authors seem to argue that all political power, no matter who's holding it, is inherently risky and tends towards corruption. That's why they put so much emphasis on limiting the power of the government and making sure individual rights are protected.
Yeah, that's a really important point. They viewed power as a double-edged sword. It's necessary for order, sure, but it's also a constant danger to freedom if it's not kept in check.
Right. And they weren't just coming up with theories. They actually used historical examples and what was happening around them to back up their points.
Yeah, and it wasn't just dry historical analysis. You can feel the passion in their writing. For instance, in one letter they say, "A power to do good is a power to do evil as well, and whoever has it will use it to both these purposes, as occasions shall invite and prompt him." That really captures their core belief, that any power, unchecked, can be turned towards harmful ends.
It's almost like they're saying, watch out, power corrupts.
Precisely. And that fear of unchecked power, it's like a thread that runs through all their arguments.
So how did this play out in their specific arguments? What were some of the things they really hammered on?
Well, freedom of speech and the press were huge for them. They saw open debate as the lifeblood of any society that wants to be free. It's how you keep those in power accountable. Imagine it like a watchdog that barks loudly whenever it senses danger.
Okay. It's like you're saying, a free society needs to be a noisy society.
Exactly. They argue that silencing dissent is far more dangerous than allowing even unpopular ideas to be out in the open and debated. And think about how relevant that is today, with all the debates about censorship and control of information online.
Yeah, that's a great point. It's almost eerie how some of their concerns from centuries ago still resonate with what we're dealing with today. But what about this idea that they were really against standing armies?
Yes, that was a huge one for them. Now remember, this was a time when most European countries had large professional armies. But Cato's authors saw these armies as tools that could be used to oppress people, not just fight wars.
Oh, so they'd be pretty wary of the military-industrial complex we see today.
Oh, absolutely. They argued that a free people should rely on a citizen militia for defense, not a professional army that could be used against them. This idea, while maybe not entirely practical today, shows just how deep their distrust of concentrated power ran.
It makes you think about the balance between security and freedom, doesn't it?
Yeah.
How do you protect yourself without creating the very tools that could be used to take away your freedom?
Right. And that leads us to another key theme, the role of reason. Cato's authors were living in a time of a lot of religious turmoil and violence in Europe. They saw fanaticism and superstition as threats to individual liberty and social harmony.
So they were basically saying, chill out, people, and let's use our heads.
Well, it was more nuanced than that, of course. They believed reason and looking at evidence should guide us, not just blind faith or dogma. This was part of a bigger trend during the Enlightenment, where thinkers tried to apply logic and reason to everything, from politics to religion.
So you're saying they'd be big fans of fact-checking websites today?
Oh, definitely. They'd be all over those. They were really critical of people blindly accepting things and wanted to encourage critical thinking.
It's also fascinating, and it seems like their ideas about corruption, freedom of speech, and the importance of reason are all connected to their bigger point about limiting government power.
Exactly. They saw concentrated power as the root of so many problems, and they believed that a government that was too powerful was inevitably going to become a threat to individual freedom.
So what were their solutions? What kind of government did they envision?
Well, they looked to the Roman Republic as a kind of model. They admired how the Romans divided power between different parts of their government, each acting as a check on the others.
That sounds a lot like the system of checks and balances that we have in the United States today.
It does, doesn't it? The founders of the U.S. were definitely influenced by these ideas. Cato's authors believed this kind of system, where power was distributed, and nobody had too much of it, was the best way to prevent tyranny.
So they weren't anarchists. They weren't against government altogether. They just wanted a government that was limited and accountable to the people.
Exactly. And that's where their emphasis on civic virtue comes in. They believed that a free society can't survive without citizens who are informed, engaged, and willing to participate in public life.
So they were calling for active citizens, not just passive bystanders.
Absolutely. They believed that apathy and complacency were just as dangerous to liberty as outright tyranny. They really thought that the people are the ultimate guardians of liberty.
I think this is a good point to stop for now. This has been an incredible overview of the main ideas running through Cato's letters. We've seen how they were concerned about corruption, advocated for free speech, and really pushed for limited government power.
It's remarkable how these ideas, written centuries ago, are still so relevant to the world we live in today.
We'll take a deeper look into some of their specific applications of these ideas in the next part of our deep dive. Stay tuned.
Welcome back to our deep dive into Cato's letters. We've laid out the main themes, but now I think it's time to see how they applied those principles to the real-world issues of their day.
Yeah, let's get into the specifics in the last part. We talked about their distrust of standing armies, but they didn't just talk about it in theory, did they?
Not at all. They pointed to specific examples, like the Roman Empire, to show how standing armies could be used to chip away at liberty and set the stage for tyranny. It's a reminder that power, especially military power, needs careful checks and balances.
That makes me think about how they viewed foreign policy in general. Were they completely against getting involved in other countries' affairs?
It wasn't quite that simple. They recognized that England had interests to protect abroad, especially when it came to trade and security. But they were wary of getting tangled up in costly wars. That only benefited the ruling elite.
So they'd probably be skeptical of some of the military interventions we've seen in recent history.
Oh, absolutely. They believed in a strong defense at home, but thought that diplomacy and trade were better ways to deal with other nations than constantly resorting to military force.
It's fascinating how some of their ideas about foreign policies still resonate today. But let's shift gears a bit and talk about something that was really important to them: religious toleration. This was a time of intense religious conflict, right?
Absolutely. Europe was still recovering from religious wars and persecutions. But Cato's authors were way ahead of their time on this issue. They argued passionately that people should be free to practice their religion without fear of persecution.
So they were advocating for a separation of church and state.
In a way, yes. They believed that forcing people to conform to a particular religion was both tyrannical and counterproductive. They thought true faith had to come from genuine conviction, not coercion.
It's amazing how they were able to articulate these ideas in a time when religious intolerance was so widespread. But they didn't just focus on big picture ideas like war and religion, did they?
No, they also got down into the nitty-gritty of everyday politics and economics, for example. They were very critical of corruption and the way it undermined public trust.
Right. It's almost like they could see right through the political maneuvering and self-dealing that went on. They were especially concerned about how corruption could erode civic virtue, weren't they?
Yes. They believed that a society obsessed with wealth and luxury would eventually lose its ability to govern itself effectively. They saw civic virtue, things like putting the common good above your own interests and being involved in your community, as essential for a free society to thrive.
So they weren't just armchair philosophers. They were trying to get people to think about how their actions impacted the health of their society as a whole. But how did their contemporaries react to these ideas? Were they popular?
Oh, Cato's letters were a sensation when they first came out. Their anonymous publication just added to their mystique, and people were dying to know who was behind these bold and provocative essays.
It's like they were the original anonymous bloggers, shaking things up and getting everyone talking.
Exactly. And they weren't just popular with the elite. Ordinary people who were hungry for a voice that championed their liberties also embraced them. They were reprinted, translated, and spread all over the English-speaking world.
Wow, so they really struck a nerve. But they must have made some enemies along the way too, right?
Of course. They were attacked by those in power, who saw them as dangerous radicals. But they were also defended by those who saw them as champions of liberty. Their work sparked fierce debates, and contributed to a growing movement for reform. It's not an exaggeration to say they played a role in the lead-up to the American Revolution.
It's incredible to think that these essays, written so long ago, could have such a lasting impact. But what about their relevance today? We've touched on it a bit. But why should we still care about what a couple of anonymous 18th century writers had to say?
That's a great question. And I think the answer lies in the timeless nature of their concerns. Their warnings about the dangers of unchecked power, the importance of free speech, and the need for active and informed citizens are just as relevant in the 21st century as they were in the 18th.
Yeah, we live in a world where governments and corporations have more power than ever before to monitor and control our lives. We see attacks on freedom of speech and the press, both from governments and powerful private interests. And we see growing concerns about the erosion of privacy and the rise of surveillance.
Exactly. And in this context, Cato's letters serve as a powerful reminder that the fight for liberty is never truly over. It's an ongoing struggle that requires constant vigilance and a willingness to stand up for what's right, even when it's difficult.
So, in a way, they're giving us a blueprint for how to be engaged citizens in a world where power is constantly trying to overreach its bounds.
That's a great way to put it. They remind us that we can't just sit back and expect our freedoms to be protected. We have to be active participants in our own governance.
Okay, I think we've covered a lot of ground here. We've seen how Cato's letters tackled big issues like war and religion, but also how they got into the weeds of everyday politics and economics. And we've talked about their impact both in their own time and their relevance for us today.
But there's still more to uncover in the next part. We'll delve even deeper into some of the specific arguments and themes that make Cato's letters so compelling and enduring.
Welcome back to the final part of our deep dive into Cato's letters. We've talked about the main themes.
And seen how their ideas, played out in their own time and still resonate with us today. Yeah, we've seen how they grappled with issues like war, religion, and the role of government. But I think it's worth
zooming in on a few key themes that really capture the essence of their message and feel especially relevant to our modern world.
Okay, let's do it. What's the first one that jumps out at you?
Well, their focus on the dangers of corruption really stands out. They saw it as this insidious force that eats away at the fabric of society, undermining trust, weakening institutions, and ultimately making way for tyranny.
They weren't just talking about corrupt individuals, though, right? They saw it as a systemic problem.
Exactly. They argued that a corrupt government can't be a just government. And in a society where wealth and influence can buy you power, the interest of the few will always be put ahead of the needs of the many.
Right, and it's almost like they could see how money and power can warp the system and create a breeding ground for all sorts of abuses. And this wasn't just a problem for them back then, was it? Not at all. They warn that corruption isn't just something that happens in countries we think of as authoritarian. It's a threat to any society, even those with strong democratic institutions. Think about things like lobbying and campaign finance issues today. Those were the kinds of things that would have really worried them.
Yeah, it's a stark reminder that we can't take good governance for granted. We always need to be vigilant and hold our leaders accountable, no matter what side of the political spectrum they're on.
Right. And that leads us to another core theme they kept coming back to: freedom of speech and the press. They saw these freedoms as absolutely vital for a healthy society.
Yeah, it's like that quote we mentioned earlier, a power to do good is a power to do evil. They believed that open debate, even about unpopular ideas, was the best way to keep those in power in check and prevent them from abusing that power.
They argued that trying to suppress ideas is far more dangerous than allowing them to be debated openly. Think about how relevant that is in today's world, with all the arguments about censorship and misinformation online.
It's like they're saying, sunlight is the best disinfectant. You can't solve problems by sweeping them under the rug. It's better to have things out in the open, where they can be discussed and debated.
Exactly. And they saw the press as playing a crucial role in this process. They believed that a free and independent press is essential for keeping citizens informed and holding those in power accountable. They'd probably be big fans of investigative journalism and whistleblowers.
They'd probably have a lot to say about the way social media is shaping our public discourse today, too, wouldn't they?
Oh, absolutely. They were writing in a very different time, of course, but their concerns about the control of information and the importance of a free exchange of ideas are incredibly relevant to the digital age.
So we've talked about corruption.
Yeah.
And freedom of speech. What else is high on the list of things Cato's authors would be concerned about today?
Well, given their deep distrust of standing armies, I think they'd have a lot to say about the increasing militarization of many societies today.
You mean the whole military-industrial complex? The fact that so much money and resources are poured into the military, even when there isn't an immediate threat.
Exactly. They saw standing armies as a potential tool of oppression, something that rulers could use to intimidate their own people and crush dissent, not just to fight external enemies.
So they wouldn't just be worried about wars and military spending. They'd be concerned about the way a powerful military can warp a society's priorities and values.
Right. They believed that a free people should only resort to war as a last resort, and that the power of the military should always be carefully checked and balanced.
It makes you think about all the ways power can be used and abused, doesn't it?
It does, and that's why they put so much emphasis on the importance of civic virtue. They believe that a free society can't survive without citizens who are informed, engaged,
Yeah.
and willing to participate in public life.
They weren't just talking about voting in elections, though, right?
Right? No, they saw civic virtue as a much broader concept. It was about putting the common good above your own self-interest, being willing to speak out against injustice, and holding your leaders accountable. They believed that a society full of passive, self-absorbed individuals would eventually lose its freedom.
It's almost like they're saying freedom isn't a spectator sport. You have to actively participate in order to keep it alive.
Exactly. And that's a message that feels more relevant than ever today. In a world that often seems obsessed with individual success and material wealth, Cato's authors would remind us that we need to cultivate a sense of shared responsibility for our communities and for the future of our society as a whole.
So we've covered a lot of ground in our deep dive into Cato's letters. We've seen how they tackled big questions about the nature of power, the importance of liberty, and the role of citizens in a free society. What's the one big takeaway you hope listeners will walk away with?
Well, their message is multifaceted. But if I had to distill it, I'd say it's a call to action. Cato's letters weren't just about complaining about problems, they were about inspiring people to get involved and make a difference. They believed that ordinary citizens have the power to shape their world and to safeguard their freedoms, but only if they're willing to step up and do the work.
That's a powerful message, and one that I think we can all take to heart. Cato's letters remind us that the fight for liberty is never truly over, and that the responsibility for protecting our freedoms rests with each and every one of us.
So go out there, armed with knowledge, courage, and a deep commitment to the principles of liberty. Be the vigilant citizens that Cato called for, and never let apathy, complacency, or fear chip away at the precious freedoms we've inherited.
That's a wrap for our deep dive into Cato's letters. We hope you found this exploration of their ideas as enlightening and inspiring as we did. Until next time, keep those pages turning and those minds engaged.